Hello, hello. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Good afternoon. My name is Lindsay Dankworth. I'm Director of Special Projects here at Galerie Lelong in New York. And I would like to welcome you to the 17th conversation in our series Dialogues. Today's conversation is held on the occasion of our exhibition, Samuel Levi Jones, Conscious Intuition, which is on view through June 17th. I'm honored to introduce today's speakers and to briefly share about them. And if you'd like to learn more, please refer to our website for their full biographies. Samuel Levi Jones is inspired by questions of authority, representation, and recorded history. He is known for challenging historical and contemporary power structures through the act of taking apart source material, generating new perspectives from which to grapple with society's ongoing ignorance and apathy. Jones's current exhibition here at Galerie Lelong, Conscious Intuition, features work composed of pulped encyclopedias, law and medical textbooks, and US flags, highlighting his practice of abstraction as a means of transformation. As the artist explains, this deconstruction and reinterpretation is driven by a desire to create a space where information that encompasses all coexists without fear, so that the pendulum stops its violent swing from one extreme perspective and back again. Jones's work can be found in museum and public collections, such as the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art in California, the Art Institute of Chicago in Illinois, Los Angeles County Museum of Art, California, the Studio Museum in Harlem, New York, Whitney Museum of American Art, New York, Dallas Museum of Art, Dallas, Texas, and Seattle Art Museum, Seattle, Washington. Danny Dunson is an art historian, art advisor, curator, and writer, and the director of curatorial studies and community partnerships for the DuSable Black History Museum and Education Center. Dunson graduated from the University of Illinois at Chicago, earning a BA in art history from the School of Art and Art History. He is a 2016 Fulbright Grant recipient and Gilman Scholarship Fellow. His research as an art historian has been primarily focused on figurative representations within African and African diasporic art. Dunson is currently conducting research that interrogates portraiture and figurative compositions aligned with space, place, memory, and the Middle Passage. Through his work with Legacy Brothers and Lab, curated a group exhibition presented by Gallery 1957 in Accra, Ghana, entitled Collective Reflections, African and Diasporic Expressions of a New Vanguard in 2020. Most recently, Dunson curated Nick Cave, Jack Cave, The Color is Fashion exhibition installed at the DuSable Museum Roundhouse from August to December of 2022, and Diaspora Stories from the CCH Pounder Collection opening March 2023 at the DuSable Museum. So without further ado, Danny Dunson and Samuel Levi Jones.
Good afternoon, everyone. I don't know, all of a sudden I found myself nervous. I'm in New York City, all the way from Chicago, and I flew in earlier this week from Brazil, so all of that African diaspora stuff you mentioned is so true with my research and with my practice. This has been an exciting week with so many fairs and gallery openings, but nothing was more exciting for me than the build-up to this moment right now. Sam, as I affectionately call him at times, have talked about doing something together for quite some time, and we're both Hoosiers from Indiana. And I have admired his work for quite some time, and it's such an honor to be here. So thank you so much for that beautiful intro and welcome. Thank you so much, Sam, for inviting me to be in conversation with you. Are you nervous?
No.
No?
Well, I'm a tad bit nervous because I don't think I've ever seen anyone so prepared before.
Oh. You know, the biggest preparation is that I remembered my glasses, because this is a very new thing. I have to remind myself I don't have 20/20 anymore,
Okay.
and we'll be in the middle of it, and I'm like, oh, I can't see now. So, no, this is just in case.
That's okay.
We've had some extensive conversations about the work, and just to give everyone a little bit of an overview of how this conversation will go today, we'll do a brief biographical sketch of your origins for those who don't know about the origins of Samuel Levi Jones. And then we'll go into some of his earlier work, what led to that, and then the work of this particular show, which includes early work as early as MFA practice to very, very recent work until what, last night maybe? Right?
Definitely last week.
That's how it goes. So, but the most exciting thing, I would say two of the most exciting elements about this fabulously titled show is that it's introducing some modalities that we're not quite as familiar with your work. One of that is sculptural installation and also figurative portraiture and environment making. So we'll end on that environment piece that you've made, and we'll start with the earliest works. But before we get there, I mentioned that we are both from Indiana. You are from Marion, Indiana.
Correct.
I'm from Gary, Indiana, which is very close to Chicago. We all know Michael Jackson and his hometown, but you have a different area. Yours is not quite as diverse. Gary, Indiana was very much a black city when I was growing up and very close to Chicago.
Yeah.
But you're in a little bit more inward into the state at Marion. Tell us about that and how that helped to inform your experience and as an artist.
A very small town, so, I always talk about how I didn't have very little, if any, exposure to the arts. A small working class town of maybe, 35,000 people. I think, population is definitely much less since then because of just sort of decline in, industry and so forth. At one point in time, there was an RCA plant, which was, I learned, like the largest producer of television tubes in the world. And it closed some 20, 25 years ago.
It probably employed most people in the town, right? Was that one of the major
Sure.
source?
And there was a General Motors plant that's,
Okay.
definitely increased in size. So, it's a difficult place to go back to. But yeah, I don't know. It's sort of strange, that from there to living in California, when I moved there for grad school, and people kind of asked me if it was a culture shock. It was actually quite liberating and nice. Just sort of, having exposure to so many more things. But yeah, I was there from maybe a year after I finished my first undergraduate school. Then lived in Indianapolis for about 8 years, then California, Chicago. And now I'm back, even though I said I wouldn't go back to Indianapolis, but.
It pulled you back.
Yeah.
And I'm in Chicago, and I have not gone back to Indiana, but only maybe to just visit you. That'll be my next reason.
Okay.
But Marion in particular, we talked about some historical happenings that really radicalized your consciousness and that informed your practice today and in the narratives that you did not always know growing up and you found out and you were able to take these different histories and really use them as a catalyst to think about the work that you actually still create now. Tell us about that.
I think so. The particular history that happened, there was a lynching that happened in 1930. 2 individuals were lynched, one of which was my stepmother's uncle. Didn't learn about it until I was in high school. Went home, asked my father about it. He's told me. And I just asked, why am I learning about this from someone at school? And his response was, we just don't talk about it. And I had some other personal experiences sort of growing up, and I think, my first exposure, I don't know, I played sports growing up too. I played football in college, I ran track. And we took a trip to Europe one summer and played a couple exhibition games, and I had a point and shoot camera with me. I took lots of photos. It was just sort of my way of seeing and observing, and then after that I took a photography class and something clicked. And later on, a few years later, I actually put together projects, went to a BFA program, and at that point learned how to sort of tie ideas with the making. And that was sort of, I think, and I was explaining this to someone else yesterday, I think if it weren't for these experiences, I probably wouldn't be a maker. And it is about the experiences and the ideas and sort of processing that through the making. It's not the making first. That wasn't my initial interest, if you will.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I think that's the premise of a conceptual practice, even in a contemporary sense. And, you know, you mentioned being an athlete, and that is an interesting time period for you because though you were successful as an athlete physically, you encountered a lot of challenges. And they showed up in your earlier photographic pieces and those kind of narratives about those challenges in this intersection of identity and parts of you that were desired and parts of you that were not. And trying to find that acceptance everywhere you went and having that kind of binary. Tell us about that in less complicated terms than what I'm using.
The school that I attended was, when I graduated from high school, I didn't have much, if any, guidance on figuring out the process of going to school and getting into school. There were a few schools that recruited me to play football, and I don't even think I looked into like what it would cost to attend a public institution. And I went to this small, predominantly white Christian school that was like really expensive, experienced sort of, racism on the fields, in the classroom, not overt, but just at any given time there were less than 3 non-white players on the team, and it became very obvious that they didn't want us to participate. And so I processed a bit of that through my earlier work, and but as of recently, at the same time, even though I wasn't allowed to participate, like that may have sort of contributed to, or that, like because it's a sort of an intense sport, a lot of contact, and as we know now, like a lot of people have head trauma, head injuries that are sort of long lasting. So
I mean, arthritis,
yeah,
everything,
yeah, yeah. So in some ways, I was spared from that, but there's always hindsight.
Everything happens to get you where you need to be.
Exactly.
And I'm grateful for that as well, because perhaps you would not be as prolific of a maker, both mentally and physically.
Yeah.
There's so much trauma that happens, especially with football players. And there's such an abuse of trauma or a disregard of it towards players of color.
Yeah.
And you're able to, do the work you do.
And I had a year of eligibility left. I finished in 4.5 years. That final semester was when I took a photography class. And I debated playing again. I chose not to, and I'm glad that I didn't, because I was really able to immerse into that photography class that I took.
Right.
Yeah.
And the photography class allowed you to physically see some of the topics that have been rolling around in your head, in a sense, to kind of visualize and compose these thoughts and ideas. Tell us about one of those early projects that really informed your practice in photography.
Are you speaking about the one titled Head for a Head?
Or whichever you like.
Yeah, I'll talk about that one. It was, when I first started the BFA program, I tried to make work that referenced my own personal experiences. Very difficult, very hard to do. And then so a few years in that program, I worked with a group that were migrant worker families, so sort of thinking about another group of people who experienced the same sort of struggles, but I wasn't so closely tied to. And I was able to, in being removed, I was able to make, and then I came back. In my final project, they gave me some sort of mementos for being on the team, if you will. One of them was a signed football, and then the other was like a helmet that was cut in half and it was on a plaque. And I used those as props to make this sort of, it was like this transitional photograph from like me being in the uniform, like the practice uniform, and the uniform comes off. And so the football that's signed, it's white, and it kind of looks like a Klansman's head, if you will. And then it transitions.
Due to its cone shape.
Yeah. And then it transitions into being, the jersey turns into like a noose, and then that head is like in the noose. And that just sort of being in that institution, it was sort of like the biblical reference of, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, and sort of like it became Neck for a Neck.
Wow. Wow.
And that was my last project in undergrad. Yeah.
Way to end it with a bang.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we get into a MFA program, and you kind of put photography aside a little bit,
Yeah.
or start thinking of photography in more conceptual and more artistic ways, not so much of the journalism or the purest forms of photography, but thinking of ways to almost create like a painterly practice with photography. And we end up with this incredible piece that's behind us, which we're going to talk a little bit more about. But tell us about how you transitioned from photography into basically where we are now.
Well, when I did the BFA program, I did do some things outside of photography. I did do some sculpture and some video. It was all really based on ideas. And so I think there were different things that I wanted to convey, and straight photography for me wasn't the best way. And I was always trying to sort of figure that out. And I became more and more interested in material. So this work, which is a work that was made in response to Gerhard Richter's 48 portraits, consisting of 48 white men, and I discovered that the source images were from the encyclopedia, and once I found that out, I said, I need a set of encyclopedia to investigate. And the craziest thing is that those books, the year of those books was from the same year that he finished that work and exhibited it for the first time, 1972.
And where was it exhibited? It was at the...
In Venice.
In Venice
Yeah.
Biennale?
Yeah.
So just to reiterate that, Gerhard Richter, the prolific, critically and commercially acclaimed artist, creates this enormous series of portraits of men, all white men. There are 43 of them.
48.
And it was done in 1972. At the same year, this work is shown in the Venice Biennale, and young Samuel decides to find an encyclopedia from the same year, 1972.
Well, incidentally,
It's the same one that he pulled.
Yeah.
It kind of points to the intentionality of the artist, what was picked.
Right.
So the choice of all white men was not something by happenstance, because in the same encyclopedia were other options.
Not
And
many.
Here you are, though. Well,
Yeah.
not many, but enough to.
And thumbing through
to
the
create
pages, they were
this.
predominantly white men in terms
Yeah.
of people who were formerly referenced. And so you would have a section like basketball, and you have athletes, or like under boxing, you have like particular boxers. I didn't seek out to get a set from that year. But They were given to me from a classmate, and they were just so happened to be from the same year.
Wow. And what do you do with this encyclopedia? You find images of 43.
Well, there are 40, so in my version, there are 42 women,
42 men.
I'm sorry, 24
24.
men, 24 women who could have been represented that year in the encyclopedia who are not. And I sourced them from like Encyclopedia on African Americans, Encyclopedia on Women, and those were all from the university's library. I attended Mills College in Oakland. And so what you see is, thinking about material and the use of material, I had an instructor who told me just print them on regular photography paper, but I repurposed the pages. So what you see is the pages from those books that I printed on, and they're inkjet prints, and they're underexposed. So this work is titled 48 Portraits Underexposed, and it is about the idea of sort of, the literal and metaphorical underexposure and sort of like fighting for visibility. So, I have a number of people who look at these, and at first they think they're black squares, and then the faces are revealed,
Depending on the angle in which you look at it.
Yeah, yeah.
So there's always, I find with your work, there's this rhetorical play of words that can happen in a sense of wit, with the conceptual, depending on the angle in which you look at it, they could be a person or just a black object.
Right.
And then, when you look at it from, for example, I see the glare of the glass, and then I see just the texture of the paper, and it looks like a masonry brick. But if I were from your angle, I would be able to see a lot more of the features, and hopefully you all can see from where you're seated from. Some images the images include some people, luminary figures within African American history, particularly Ruby Dee, Madam C.J. Walker, Maya Angelou, Eartha Kitt. I mean, it goes on and on. W.C. Handy, and I mean, just so many names that we know quite a bit, and then there are names that we're not as, we don't hear as regularly. So when I'm thinking about starting off with the Marion story of this lynching story that you did not know about, in this historical narrative that was kind of erased or suppressed, and then this idea of identity and parts of you being praised, other parts of you not being allowed in the main narrative. I asked all of those questions, even leading up to A Head for a Head, because it really talks about your practice, that the trajectory that you're on till today. This idea of doing an excavation in a sense of history and pulling figures and stories forward. But you bring them forward, however you cover them, as well as, again, I said there's angles in which you look at this and you may not see. Yeah. This is, they're not resolved images. They have a bit of a blur, and why do you do that? Why, what type of viewer engagement with the work are you seeking to find?
I think initially when I first started working with the material, so, you know, I went from this to working with the book cover, so, and I really wanted to show this work because a lot of people didn't know about it. Even you yourself, you're like, no, wait, what?
Right.
And you know, it's a very important part of the history of my practice. And you know, I went from there to, you know, later that summer after I finished grad school, and I had a conversation with Mark Grafford, and he encouraged me to keep investigating the material, so I was breaking it down more. And when I peeled the covers, so this work right here to my left is more of kind of like what I traditionally do, and it's been evolved a lot more in this exhibition. But I pulled the pages out from the books, soaked the pages, or not the pages, but the covers, to loosen the material from the cardboard that makes it rigid. And when I laid the first few out, I was like, it was visually interesting. And then I initially just started sewing them together. That was just a way to put them together. But I think, and you know, this is quite different. So I'm bringing in that information, that lost information, and then with everything else, I'm completely destroying it, but not bringing in the lost information. But I think there's just something about destroying the material, and it's sort of like the encyclopedia, if you will, which was the book that I first worked with, was like a stand-in for the power structure, if you will. And even with the law books, it's sort of like the reference to the structure of the system, and just this sort of cathartic act of destroying it. Not really thinking so much about recreating it,
yeah,
but really just destroying it and creating something visually interesting to address these matters.
Well, through this destruction, so much is created, especially for those who are engaging with your work. So you are tearing down these particular powers and being led by your questions, your anger, your thirst for justice. However, once these are created, and like I said, there's different angles in which you can see it, the pieces cause the viewer to slow down. The viewing process, much more different than a very clear image where we all go through our phones and we go through Instagram and we just swipe really quickly within seconds and take in some data or sound bites, and it's the next thing. You cannot do that visually or audibly with your work. You have to sit with it. Right. And it then returns what was taken from these stories and these people when time wasn't spent on them. It was just a passing by. It returns that to these people, these historic moments, that gives them something they deserve, which is the pondering, the reflection, and the processing. And hopefully encouraging us to live better lives.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. There is a definitely sort of that part and that element of slowing down because we're distracted by so many things. And we miss a lot of details. And I mean, in a lot of ways, you know, things are sort of, they're right there. They're sort of right in front of us in our face in terms of issues and problems and what does it mean to slow down and like really pay attention to what's going on and then ask questions about that rather than sort of accepting it as it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is definitely a theme that is a through line throughout your practice. And it starts here with these figurative works, which I still think is just so incredibly badass that you're showing us work from MFA time. There's so many artists who would, oh, I didn't do that. That was 10 years. You know, but it was good then. It's good now. It stands the test of time. And I find that very inspiring and also very bold. But I understand why, because of how the work operates. So we have this large grouping here that actually we're really fortunate to see. This is just the second time it's been shown in whole. That's first time on the East Coast that it's being exhibited all at once.
First time on the East Coast. It's been shown, you know, in smaller spaces. Sort of and you know, most people don't know about this work.
Yeah.
I'd say the only other significant place, if you will, that it was probably seen by a larger audience was Expo 2016.
Okay.
And at that time, they were not framed. But yeah, it's exciting to have it here and to be able to share it, for sure.
And I think one of the most important details out of this is that you created the paper. That's going to go into the practice of what we'll talk about throughout these other pieces. And for many of us who are more familiar with Sam's work, we know about the pulp and the tearing up of a book and then, you know, creating this consistency that you then reconstruct an object with. And that leads us into what we're more familiar with the pieces of this show. One of the elements that I did not think of until we were having a conversation is how you have a practice that is very much like a painter and how you're creating these pulps, but the colorization of not only how they're mixing chemically at the time, but also how they dry is very important in assembling the palette. And then where you place the pieces and the different fields of color, just like someone composing using oil or watercolor. Tell me about that. I think, how important is the palette and colorization to this process?
The first one that I did was quite bizarre. Because, you know, when I was sewing the works together, I composed the work on the floor. And when I work pulp, I work with it up. But when I do the book covers, I compose them on the floor and I pin them together, then sew them. But the first pulped work that I made, and it's a different gesture, if you will. And it's a different way of thinking about it. The approach of putting it together is quite different. So I went into it without a real plan. And rather than having these geometric objects and just sort of this with it, I kind of stopped for a moment and I was thinking about it. And then I just was like, stop thinking about it, just go at it. And just applied it. And you know, did think, like, because I've never painted, if you will, like in a traditional way, but realized I was closer to that, if you will. So it's definitely a different approach, you know, sort of, and a lot of the pulp works I made, a lot of them sort of have been geometric, and this is sort of, I've done a little, this is sort of, it's quite different, and
It is.
it's,
Oh, wow.
that work was a bit of a challenge, and so I had to spend a lot more time with the work as well. And then so, in some of these works, like the 4 works back here, they all, if you will, have an underpainting. So the works where I sew the pieces together, the book covers, are underneath the pulp. And that one was very challenging, the large black one, because the underpainting looked quite nice. And I was on the fence about covering it with pulp, but I'm glad that I did. And so that was there's a way of abstracting my process, if you will.
Yeah.
In another conversation that I had with Mark, we talked about abstracting the process. And it's, I think the idea too of covering the original works with the pulp was just sort of this way in which, I think about, on an exterior, think about the way in which systems should be changed and challenged, and then also in the way that I did that, thinking about the ways in which I change and challenge myself. Yeah, and it's been fun, it's liberating. I like sort of the way in which I've changed my process and it's evolved, because, doing this over and over can be quite redundant at, one point boring. And then playing with different materials, and the triptych of it that you see over here, this one has some of it too, but I also deconstructed flags. I pulped the flags as well.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about the deconstruction materials and not take for granted that some may not know the source materials. We've mentioned it a few times, but law books, let's talk about some of those earlier works and talk about the book binding process to kind of take us to where we are now.
Yeah, so it started off with the encyclopedias, and then and I started working with law books because, it's really interesting because these smartphones, as we call them, at that point in time, they were becoming more and more prevalent. And then you had more and more incidents where people have a documentation device, and they were filming, incidents of police brutality, so that became more and more prevalent. And then that led me to acquiring the law books and thinking about that material that was, with the encyclopedias, I'm dealing with issues of lost histories and narratives, and then thinking about the law books in relationship to who it benefits, who it doesn't benefit, and then I think the first group of books I bought some 500-600 books from a law firm.
Oh wow!
Yeah, and they were all that was interesting because I wasn't sure what I was going to get, because the finish, they were sort of on the outside they were all the same, and then when I took them apart, sort of there's variations in terms of like the tonality.
Yeah.
Some of them are paper, some of them are cloth. So I was nervous. I was like, I'm buying all these books. I don't know what I'm going to get. Cross my fingers, but it turned out well. And then when I was first sort of composing those works, in particular with the encyclopedias, I was putting them side by side, top to bottom, and so it was sort of this more of a grid, if you will. And then I started cutting them up and overlaying them, and just sort of playing with my approach to composing them. And then another thing about the color palette in the pulped work is the color comes from the color of the book cover. So you see the green, the cover was green, all the black. I have lots of black book covers, and so that's how the color comes about. Yeah.
Now you gather these sources, since they are books. How much time do you actually spend going through the books?
Very little, if any.
That's really interesting.
If I did, I think I'd get so consumed in that that I wouldn't actually make the work. I wouldn't make the work.
Right.
Yeah.
And oftentimes, just the title of the structures alone, of the books, kind of informs you so much of what's in there.
Yeah.
And who's benefiting and who's not, and the power dynamic, and also the year in which the book was printed. All of that, those little bits of information you're taking into account when you're destroying them.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So now we're engaging with other materials, not just books. We're some fabrics, which are flags and.
I've worked with football material as well.
Football. So the pigskin, or
from the leather from the footballs, and so the vinyl material from the pads, the tackling pads as well. I've deconstructed a couple of football tackling sleds.
Why football? Is this because of your former athletic history, or is it also a contemporary statement on what's happening in athletics today?
Yes. In my photographic work, that referenced my personal experience, and I sort of moved away from that, and then came back to it through like the whole Colin Kaepernick incident.
Yeah.
And that's what sort of roped me back into it, because I kind of that experience for me was a bit traumatic, I think. And I'd say, after the years, so maybe, I graduated in 2000, I think it was, left Indianapolis in 2008, and from that point, in that time period, I would have these reoccurring sort of dreams, and like dreaming about different scenarios of my experience. And it wasn't until we moved to California for grad school and I entered the grad program that those dreams stopped happening. So it was like I had to sort of, I don't know if it was the physical location as well. I was still in Indiana and then leaving and sort of, it was like a different chapter of my life. And sort of thought about, forgotten about that whole experience. And then I was a little bit hesitant to go back into it in response to the incident with Colin Kaepernick. But I did. I've only had a few dreams since revisiting it.
It's really interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many personal ties to that. And of course, politically and socially, as a nation, we've paid attention to this, some of us more than others. And also the price that was paid for that activism, and very little justice towards that bravery, that active moment that Kaepernick took, and it's like how it just keeps on rolling around, just producing and producing in a capitalistic wheel, somewhat like these books and laws, and this mass production of it just has to go on and keep going forward.
Yeah.
So I feel like you just have to keep breaking it down.
For sure.
And keep destroying it
Yeah.
and bringing it forward. But let's talk about the flag, because now, since we're talking about national issues and problems and challenges, the flag is something historically through the artistic canon that's come up many, many times from people like Jasper Johns and so many others, through the Black Liberation flag and even quilting and so many different moments. The flag has this history of being the least desired material to be destroyed. It's almost considered like a crime, if you will. It's a taboo. No, the flag. Don't burn it, but then it often gets interrogated, that piece of fabric. What led you to that in your practice?
I had a bunch of flags given to me by a fellow artist, and I hadn't considered working with that material, and they were given to me. But I think I'll speak on that in relationship to, I've also worked with art books, art history books. Yeah. And then so even, in the first time I exhibited at the Paris Gallery, I was given print portfolio material to work with that artists had used. And I said to them, I said, when I'm using this material, I'm being critical of the place from which it's coming. So, using this art material that has sort of these historical, references, and when we think about, you think about in the same way with the encyclopedias, like the lack of inclusion, right. And I'm participating in this thing, but I think, so I'm talking about this also in relationship to the flags, even though you participating in something, you support it, but I think it's also very important to be critical of it as well. Yes. In a way in which, you to bring about change and not think of it as just okay, but like thinking about the issues that exist. And it's like, we can participate in it, we can celebrate it, but like, we have to be critical at the same time in order to make it better.
Well, you're also addressing how difficult it is to actually 100% opt out of it. In a utopian vision, sure, but we know that's not the most immediate or realistic option, even though it's, again, in a utopian form, the best idea, but we have to work through that conceptual idea to actual real life practice. So then it's the interrogation, the resisting, the change, the fighting that we've all tried to do for many, many years. Right. And that's definitely where I see your work. I want to talk about this again, coming back to the newer pieces where you've created the compositions over a composition. So just to reiterate that, in these that you see that are like large fields of color without the bindings that you would see there are the more traditional pieces. And the earlier works that we really know Samuel's practice for, with the stitching of these colors of the bindings. You create that, fully realize, and then you fall in love with your piece because it's yours and it's amazing, because I know it is, but I don't get to see it because you completely cover it with this pulp. And then, well, not completely. You allow pieces to peer through. So it's hard for me to not think of your work allegorically, and you know, there's a story behind all of this with what it's saying through its conception. So why cover it and then still allow these pieces of the under composition?
Sometimes, well, so there's actually only one, the green one,
Yeah.
where the underpainting, if you will, does not come through.
That one's titled Fragility,
Yeah.
if I'm not mistaken. I'm correct. Okay, good. See, that's why this is here.
It's good, because I don't always remember the title.
Yeah, but I have to.
And then the large black one, so
Yes.
the spines come through, and the spines are actually sewn into the underpainting, as I've been calling it. And then I guess this one here, the multicolor one, there's no visibility of the underpainting. And we, in the framing of those works, we decided to have a bit of a larger gap so you can see the edge, but most people may not look at it. I think artists have a tendency to go up and get really close to a work to look at details.
Of course.
So yeah, I wanted to leave that a bit wider so that it was visible. And I was having a conversation with someone yesterday and said, you know, some artists will say that this exists and it doesn't really exist. But, you know, in particular, the black one, the pulp can be a bit unpredictable. As it dries, it shrinks.
right.
And so there's some shrinkage and crackage, and you can see the underpainting. Uh-oh. Somebody's alarm. Continue.
We can see the underpainting.
Yeah, you can see it through the cracks.
I mean, that takes us to a really good point.
Yeah.
You mentioned it earlier, materials, the materiality, your obsession with what the composition is constructed of. So there's two things that happen. First, you're just constantly thinking. So you have all of these thoughts, all of these, if I can say, genius ideas and brilliant ideas as you're interrogating history, both contemporary and past. And then there's the other practice of methodology where you're interrogating materials and what they do, and this curiosity, like a lab scientist, or just playing around figuring out, if I do this and do that, what am I going to get? That curiosity that you have between the conversation and the materiality, it seems to be very important, and it's the foundation of your work. If we can talk about that a bit.
Yeah, it is. You know, and the thing about the material too, there's an unpredictability about it.
Yeah. So it leaves you with another question at the end, right?
Yeah, it
Once
does.
it's done,
But I've been okay with that for some reason, and sort of not knowing and sort of giving up. I think I'm pretty good at giving up control. Maybe not always, but I'm definitely in this case, I'm okay with giving up the control of what the outcome of the material will be. And you know, another thing I want to mention too in this work is the squares that show up. So.
Yeah.
And making this work and sort of and talking about the unpredictability of the material, it's a bit difficult to, and sort of, you know, making, you know, a large monochromatic like that to get it to dry consistently. That's sort of what I try to do so that the color doesn't, when it dries, it varies. And I had this moment where I was covering up one of those areas, and I don't know why. I just put in the square, and then I put it up on the wall after it dried, and I was like, shit, the portrait. It was relatively the same size as the portrait.
That's
so
right.
Thinking about how these newer works will communicate with the portraits, and that's why, you know, after I did the first one, had the portrait, or had that square or rectangle show up in a few of the works to sort of, you know, have a bit of dialogue between the works as well. But that sort of lack of control and just sort of going into it. I don't sketch anything. I just go at it and just sort of let it happen. A bit of an intuitive process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A conscious
Yeah.
intuition.
Yeah.
The conscious intuition, which is the name of this show. Leading from this conversation of materiality, it's time to talk about your newer works of sculpture and installation. And we're looking at this piece here. Tell us the title of this to the side, for those who can't see.
I don't remember that one, but this one is. I don't remember the title of that one.
But that one's Lost Truth.
And this one is.
But then, yeah.
This one is Trojan Horse.
Trojan Horse, yeah.
Yeah, and so.
We can talk about Trojan Horse first,
Yeah.
actually.
So
and
these-
that's to the center of the room behind these handsome gentlemen here filming us.
I made an attempt to make one of these some years ago when I was at a residency in San Francisco, and the place is called Recology, and you source materials from the dump. And I picked up a shipping crate, and then I wasn't sure what I was going to do with it, but I then at some point started thinking about the Middle Passage, and I looked up terms that were associated with the Middle Passage and saw this one called Home Passage. And so I pulped all these pages of encyclopedia and used the crate as a mold and filled it up with pulp and then stuffed books down into it. And so as it dried, I opened it up and it looked like a block of concrete, and these books were sort of protruding from the concrete. And and that was just straight pulp. So these have a resin mixed into them, and I was trying to figure out the process because that initial piece that I made, it didn't dry so well. Actually, there was really bad mold on it, and I was going to show it in the Studio Museum exhibition in 2015. I made the mistake of not inspecting it, so we didn't realize it was in that shape when we opened it up at the museum. But anyway.
Oh, wow.
So this is a revisitation of that, and that's why the crates are there. So it's that idea of, so the idea of the title and the crate was destroying this Eurocentric material and sending it back on the home passage.
And oftentimes in our conversations, you'll say, well, I'm not an art historian, or I'm not a historian. And I'm like, well, I am. And your work is so aligned within history, even in stories and narratives that you're not aware of. So I was just reminding myself of Henry Box Brown, who is this enslaved African in Virginia, who shipped himself in a box that was about 3 feet by 2 feet, and got himself to Philadelphia. So he put himself in this kind of cargo box, and through that disguise was able to retreat to freedom. And this idea of putting something in the box and sending it back to its origins, that's very, historically aligned, and you're just working intuitively. But it's just interesting how these narratives that are often suppressed and aren't very few people know about come up in this contemporary practice of yours. And I think starting back with those early conversations about the lynching in Marion, and then experiencing these 43 portraits from Gerhard, and none of them were people of color, none of them were women, and this constant resistance shows a tradition of resistance and Black artistic practice in the United States, as well as people of color throughout the world, and particularly in the Americas. And I just find that fascinating, even with the color palette that comes organically through the mixing of these. Somehow these reds, these greens, these blacks still pop up in this resisting, forceful way. Like, here we are, you can't get rid of it.
Yeah.
Can't get rid of the conversation. So I think talking about these sculptures and allowing us to walk around them in the round, again, slows down that viewing process. It makes us ponder the making, but also the conceptual element of what it's about.
Yeah.
Did you have fun with this new modality?
I did, and as I talked about earlier, just sort of changing the practice and trying something new to keep it interesting. And so there's these works and the works on paper that I did at Diodone, and that was a bit of a collaborative process, and getting out of the solitude of the studio, which can drive you a bit crazy at times. It's nice to get out and sort of work with others and have that social engagement interaction and get new ideas within the work.
For sure.
Yeah, so I think we also don't want to forget to talk about the installation. So
That's the last thing. We're gonna talk, so just as you continue to look around this exhibition, we have these two sculptural pieces. But we want to land on the installation that we're both excited about. And it is the Library of Alexandria. And it's in this back room here, or the front room. Once you're done with this conversation, please feel free to walk back there and experience. Not only is it installation, but I think it's a environment. It's incredibly immersive in a sense, not in a digital way, but actually in an ancient way of actually being in an environment, in a labyrinth, and experiencing something. Tell us what we are going to see in that space and how it came to be.
You know, that I was thinking about, and just sort of, and looking at some of my peers and like how they've evolved and getting off the wall and creating an experience. And I started thinking about that and sort of as I've evolved in my practice and, getting off the wall and creating that space. So that work there, I was thinking about a library, if you will. And then also thinking about growing up and like having to do research papers and only being able to access certain information. And just thinking like, you go to a library, there's like lots and lots of books.
Right.
But I think at a young age, at least for me, not really thinking about, just sort of thinking like everything is here, but everything isn't there. And then so, going to this space and I created those, I made molds from an encyclopedia, and those are pulped pages, but thinking about going into the library and sort of having these books that are inaccessible. So there's inaccessible information. And that's sort of, what that is about, yeah.
So let's get into the actual books. How they're constructed. When you see these forms that are this kind of concrete color, and they're constructed of a pulp and molded into the shape of the book.
Right.
And what were the sources for these? Were there
These are encyclopedia pages.
Other encyclopedias?
Yes.
Why the title of Library of Alexandria?
Because, and actually, looked it up recently and on Wikipedia, and it was sort of, I guess it's, the way that it stated it was there was a debate of whether the library had burned down or not. And then you and I spoke about this, about there being another library in recent years that burned, was it somewhere in South America maybe? I forget exactly where.
Yeah.
But, these sort of spaces that hold or house information, and then also thinking about the possibility of, or questioning, were the burning of these spaces, was it arson? So was it an intentional way of getting rid of information or hiding information? And so that was what what the title was about.
Wow. It also reminds me of a proverb or a quote I've heard saying that when an old person dies, a library is destroyed. So how humans are the containers of all of this information. And it also reminds me of how the figure, though not literally present in your work, always tends to pop up in your work. When we think of who constructs books, whose stories we're trying to have access to, be it law or an encyclopedia, or even the flag with the fabrication or the football paraphernalia. It's all this kind of representation of the human identity within these objects, again, with the box. So it's like you're abstracting, you're taking away the literal idea of the body, but however, it's still there. But with this piece, you're giving us, as those who are engaging with your work, a way to bodily engage with these ideas that are ancient, the recording of thought, and then kind of walk and think about through that. I think that is really incredible. Why are we talking so much about space and place these days, and everyone wants an experience? I mean, my hotel has a weird experience fee for $45 a day. What is that? I don't know. But just this thing, like because we're in this virtual space, you know, we're online, we're here and there. But all of a sudden we want experience. I think a lot of it comes from COVID and not being able to touch each other, and desiring that closeness. And now there's a desire for a conversation between the dialogue and the past and present, and also this imagined future within a space.
Yeah.
And
I think part of that is that when you have that experience and you're walking through a space, you're engaging with it in a different way versus seeing something that's two-dimensional on the wall. I think you feel a less amount of time, you spend a less amount of time with that object, but if you're in there, you're spending more time because you're observing. There's so much more to see, so much more to observe, and there are these different senses that interact with that. So it is a way of slowing the viewer down more to have an experience and sort of question what's going on and have a sense of interest, if you will, to figure out what's going on and be more involved with it.
To be more involved. I think that's a really good place to transition, because you and I can do this for another 2 hours.
Yes.
But I want to open the room up to have dialogue with all of these lovely people who've come today and have some questions and answers or comments. And if anyone would like to join us in conversation with a statement or a question. Yes, please.
Hey. Yeah.
I want to repeat her question
Okay.
so those to have it amplified. She's asking about the choices made, the decisions made about the installing of the shelving and the actual construction of the space, and what were your intentions behind it?
Yeah, so the shelving itself, I was going
just
to
talked about
I was going to commission someone to make shelves for me, and I was having a conversation with an artist, and they asked, "Why don't you just source the material? Because that's what you do." And I was like, "Yeah, of course." And then I think it's obvious that they are from a library, and that's that plays into it, because that's really what I wanted to convey. Yeah, we sourced those off of eBay, and they were sent here directly to the gallery. And I think this is the most, getting ready for this exhibition I've been the most nervous for this one than anything that I've had, because that was the first time that we saw it, like putting it together. But once I started putting the books on the shelves, I was like, this is working. I was able to relax. But in terms of like the number of books, that was a lot of work to make what we have now. There's approximately maybe 90 books on there too, but I think that also plays into the void. So there's still sort of missing information, and thinking about the books or the information that is not there on the shelves, if you will. And then we used a rug because I was thinking about the Library of Alexandria, sort of thinking about trying to depict, a specific location, if you will. So I found a Persian rug, and then also there's a different experience from walking from the concrete floor to the rug as well. Yeah, yeah.
Yes, yeah. Yes, please.
About what?
Reliquaries. So those religious containers that hold bones of saints, and they're hidden usually from view, or just through a tiny viewfinder. There's something about that and memento mori that speaks to the works on the wall, and then the reliquary speaks to the works, the sculptures. And I wonder if you had any engagement in thinking about those.
Yeah, I wasn't familiar with that, or sort of thinking about that much. But it's interesting that you say that, because I did a residency, I don't know, this may be a bit of a tangent, but I did a residency at Indiana University, and they have some involvement with some indigenous mounds in southern Indiana, and a lot of that material is in their archives, if you will, and they've been working on repatriating those remains back, and they make it, I'm going to say it anyway, they make it sound as though the majority, if not all of that material has been returned, but I got to tour the storage area in there, and there's like lots of it, and it was very eerie. Yeah.
Further that one step further, there's a school called the Mound School in Cleveland. It's actually on top of
What?
an indigenous mound.
Wow.
So there are these ways in which it speaks that same sort of effervescence, right, of science stories that they still remain, and you feel the friction when you're in this space.
Yeah.
So how do you make that? How do you visualize that? So I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Yes, please. What do you want? I'm sorry. Repeat that once again so I can say it. What do you want people to understand about the world when they walk away from your work and they intake it? What do you want them to leave with?
I think one thing that I've been saying is that, you know, I trying to initiate or create an interest or desire to question, especially systems of authority and power. And I don't feel like I try not to come to a place to where I'm making a definitive statement, but I'm always questioning and thinking about the possibilities. And though there may be multiple answers, if you will, but I think there are sort of, in various contexts where people will have this idea of truth, I think, you know, thinking about connecting dots and not always being dismissive, but also really in particular, thinking about these entities of power where we put a lot of trust in and we just sort of go along with it and we don't question it, and then there are those who do question and they're sort of dismissed or become outcasts.
Yeah.
And so I think we should sort of do better at sort of creating a space where we can interact, and if we disagree,
It's okay.
yeah, yeah. You too. The code. Yeah, it's really interesting because so the first question, I didn't understand exactly what you asked about.
Is there a book that has influenced what you're doing now?
Nothing in particular that's influenced what I'm doing now. But the second part of your question, the second question, in talking about the material and the choice of use of material, it's really interesting because I've been asked if I'm going to move completely away from this. I don't think that I will, and I'll definitely sort of always want to incorporate both. But for me, I think personally, just sort of the process of making, it's an outlet, and so it's really interesting how, working with this, it's easy to see that I've used a book, and then versus that, it's not there, it's not visible, but I also think about sort of the further abstraction that I'm doing with the material in relationship to how we as individuals, and I say this, time and time over again, about how we are abstracted to not see, what's present. And I think that is what that is about for me in the abstraction and changing the material where it becomes unrecognizable.
I'm reminded of something you said a couple of times about control, and you're relinquishing control, and you seem to be okay with that, even with the not knowing how the shells would turn out, sending them to the gallery without you being there. And there's a relinquishing of control, as she mentioned, with trusting a system with Henry Box Brown, and also returning these boxes there. There's still a trust in, perhaps maybe in humanity, that someone's gonna make the right decision, but there's also a letting go of determining if they will or not. And that's where you cover up a fully realized piece and trust the process of covering it with this pulp, and then relinquish the control and relinquish ego of having that composition praised as is, such as what we've done, and then risking the acceptance or not of it being completely covered up. There seems to be a strive towards this comfort of a discomfort in the tension within these in-between places, which I think is truly a goal that we should try to reconcile with, this idea of agreeing to disagree, this idea of loving and also having a critique or a negative critique, and still being a part of, but still saying this needs improvement. Being comfortable with that in-between space, I think, is critical to advancement, and it's the most discomforting thing to experience. And I think your work is helping us to facilitate that and helping us to think along those lines.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Is there anything else? And I'll close that out. I think we're going to wrap it up with that last statement. But you are around to answer any questions after this. And if you want your ear chatted off by me, I'll answer questions as well. I want to thank Sam for your generosity and vulnerability through this process, and again for inviting me, as well as Galerie Lelong, and for your hospitality and also fortitude for bringing such an advanced show that everyone is talking about all over town. So thank you so much, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you, Sam, for a wonderful conversation. And if
Thank
you want to
everyone for coming out,
continue,
too.
and thank you for coming. And if you want to continue the conversation, please stay. Join us for refreshments. Thank you all for being here.